The year was 1947, and the winter approaching the high plains was not merely a seasonal shift. It was a predicted catastrophe. The war had ended 2 years prior, leaving behind a surplus of industrial materials and a population weary of struggle. Yet the atmosphere over the northern territories held no regard for human exhaustion. In the high country, where the wind did not simply blow but scoured the earth, a standard timber cabin was often less a shelter than a sieve for precious heat. It was here, on a ridge exposed to the full violence of the coming norther, that Elias Thorne decided to build something that defied every architectural tradition of the region. He did not stack logs in the manner of his ancestors, nor did he frame a box of dimensional lumber like the new speculative builders in the valley. Instead, he looked to the surplus yards filled with the detritus of the Pacific Theater. He brought home galvanized steel ribs, curved sheets of corrugated metal, and a design philosophy that his neighbors considered nothing short of madness. The premise was visually jarring against the natural tree line, a gleaming, semicircular tunnel intended to encase a smaller, traditional living structure. It was a Quonset hut, a relic of island warfare, repurposed for a battle against freezing temperatures. Sarah, his wife of 20 years, stood by the pile of curved steel, her gloved hands resting on the cold metal. She did not question the aesthetics. She knew the reality of the previous winter, where water froze in the basin 3 feet from the stove. Her support was not loud, but it was absolute, grounded in a shared survival instinct that outweighed social convention. The town below saw an eyesore. Elias and Sarah saw a hypothesis waiting to be tested. The ridicule began before the first bolt was tightened. The local wisdom, entrenched in generations of wood-burning stoves and chinking logs, held that a metal house would be a freezer in winter and an oven in summer. Tom Miller, a rancher whose property bordered the Thorne claim, stopped his truck one afternoon as Elias was laying out the foundation rail. The air was already crisp, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. Miller leaned out of his cab, observing the strange curvature of the steel ribs rising from the concrete footings. He gestured to the shiny arch with a dismissive wave. "You're building a tomb, Elias," Miller said, his voice flat and practical. "That tin creates no heat. It attracts the frost. You'll be chipped out of there by spring, assuming you don't freeze solid the first night the mercury drops below zero." Elias did not stop his work. He continued to tighten a nut on the anchor bolt, the wrench clicking rhythmically in the silence that followed. "It's not the tin that holds the heat, Tom," Elias replied, not looking up. "It's the air that sits still beneath it." Miller laughed, a sharp sound that vanished quickly in the wind. "Air is free," Miller said, shifting his truck into gear. "Wood costs money. You're trying to cheat the cold with nothing." He drove off, leaving a cloud of dust that drifted over the strange skeletal framework. Sarah stepped out from the small supply shed, handing Elias a thermos of coffee. She looked at the retreating truck, then back at the steel ribs. "He thinks we're fools," she stated, her voice devoid of worry, merely stating a fact. "Let him burn his wood," Elias said, taking the coffee. "We're catching the heat he throws away." The construction phase was a race against the calendar, a deliberate exercise in engineering rather than carpentry. The logic of the structure relied on a principle that was well understood in industrial applications, but entirely foreign to residential building in the region: the thermal break. Elias was not simply living in a tin can. He was building a house within a house. The inner sanctum was a modest rectangular frame structure, efficient and tight. The outer shell was the Quonset steel, arching over the inner box with a clearance of 4 feet at the sides and 6 feet at the peak. This created a massive encapsulated volume of air. In 1947, insulation materials like fiberglass were not the standard. Builders relied on sawdust, newspaper, or rock wool. Elias used rock wool to insulate the inner cabin, But the true genius lay in the dead airspace between the cabin and the steel shell. The theory was that the outer steel would deflect the wind, taking the brunt of the convective cooling, while the air trapped inside the shell would act as a buffer zone. It was a double envelope system. Sarah worked the interior, applying the lath and plaster, sealing every crack around the windows with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. She understood that the system relied on integrity. A single leak would compromise the envelope. Elias worked the steel, bolting the corrugated sheets with rubber washers to seal the rivet points. It was heavy, dangerous work. The sheets were slick with morning frost, and the wind threatened to turn them into sails before they could be secured. There were no decorative flourishes, no wasted movements. Every bolt had a purpose. The structure looked alien, a silver beetle hunkered down in the brown grass. But as the final sheets were placed, the acoustic change inside was immediate. The howling wind was muffled to a distant hum. By mid-November, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The barometer in the local general store dropped steadily for 3 days, a phenomenon that usually signaled a heavy snow, but this time it signaled something more violent. The animals knew it first. The cattle moved to the low draws, huddled together with their backs to the north. The sky turned a bruised purple, the light filtering through the clouds taking on a strange watery quality. Inside the Quonset-Covered cabin, the sensation was distinct from the typical frontier home. Usually, as a storm approached, a wooden house would creak and groan, the drafts whistling through the chinking. Here, there was a heavy silence. The outer steel shell absorbed the wind load, vibrating slightly, but the inner cabin remained still. Elias sat at the small table, reviewing a ledger of temperatures he had recorded over the past week. Sarah was preparing a meal on the cast-iron stove, the smell of roasted root vegetables filling the small space. There was an intimacy in the isolation. They were effectively living inside a thermos bottle. "The radio says 20 below by midnight," Sarah said, placing a plate on the table. She didn't look afraid. She looked prepared. "That's static temperature," Elias corrected gently. "With the wind chill, it will strip the heat off a wall in seconds." He stood up and walked to the single window of the inner cabin, looking out into the dim space between the cabin wall and the steel arch. He had placed a thermometer there, suspended in the buffer zone. It read 40 degrees, while the true outdoors was already dropping past 10. "The buffer is holding," he noted. "The wind can't scrub the heat off the inner walls if it can't reach them." Then the storm struck. It did not arrive with a gradual increase in snowfall. It arrived as a wall of kinetic energy. The impact on the outer steel shell sounded like gravel being thrown against a drum, a continuous roaring clatter that would have been deafening if not for the insulation of the inner cabin. The wind speed was clocked at 60 miles per hour at the weather station in the valley, but up on the ridge the gusts were likely higher. In a traditional cabin, this was the moment when the inhabitants would retreat to the immediate radius of the stove, wrapping themselves in wool blankets as the corners of the room turned sub-freezing. The wind pressure would force cold air through the microscopic gaps in the wood grain itself. But Elias and Sarah sat at their table, unburdened by heavy coats. The candle on the table did not flicker. The physics of the arch were proving superior to the flat wall. The wind, hitting the curve of the Quonset, accelerated over the top, creating an area of low pressure that actually helped to pull the structure tighter to the ground rather than tearing it apart. Elias watched the thermometer mounted on the interior wall. It held steady at 68 degrees. He pulled on his heavy coat, not because he was cold, but because he needed data. "I'm checking the gap," he told Sarah. She nodded, watching him open the heavy insulated door that led from the inner sanctum to the buffer zone under the steel arch. As he stepped into the intermediate space, the roar of the storm became louder, echoing off the steel, but the air, the crucial, captive air, was not freezing. It was cool, perhaps 45 degrees, fueled by the escaping waste heat of the cabin and protected from the wind stripping the exterior. He looked at the outer steel. It was vibrating violently, battling the full fury of the blizzard. But the inner cabin stood untouched, a peaceful island in a sea of chaos. Just a mile away, Tom Miller was likely feeding his stove every 20 minutes, fighting a losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics. The night deepened, and the temperature outside plummeted into ranges that turned materials brittle. At 3 a.m., the thermometer on the exterior porch, visible only through a frost-cleared patch of the double-pane glass, read 22 degrees below zero. The wind, relentless and screeching like a banshee, stripped any residual heat from the landscape, creating a wind chill factor that would freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. Inside the Quonset, however, the dynamic was fundamentally different from any other structure in the county. Elias sat by the stove, not feeding it, but merely watching the damper. In a standard cabin, the pressure differential caused by the high wind would be sucking warm air out through the chimney and pulling freezing drafts in through the floorboards, a phenomenon known as the stack effect. But the Quonset shell had equalized the pressure. The air in the buffer zone, the space between the steel arch and the wooden living quarters, acted as a static atmospheric blanket. Because the wind could not penetrate the steel skin to hit the inner cabin directly, the pressure inside the living space remained neutral. The stove drew air calmly and efficiently, burning the wood slowly rather than roaring through it. Sarah slept on the cot in the corner, her breathing rhythmic and undisturbed, a testament to the stability of the environment. There was no need to huddle. The ambient temperature in the room was 65 degrees. Elias moved quietly to the buffer zone door again, opening it just a crack to check the intermediate thermometer. It had dropped, certainly. The steel outer shell was conducting the cold of the blizzard, but the buffer zone air was still holding at 38 degrees. This was the critical differential. The inner cabin was not losing heat to a 20 below zero environment. It was losing heat to a 38-degree environment. The thermal stress on the inner walls was reduced by nearly 60 degrees compared to a house fully exposed to the elements. This was the physics of survival, operating in silence while the world outside screamed. As dawn approached, bringing a gray, diffused light but no cessation to the wind, the logistical victory of the design became apparent through the metric of fuel consumption. In a typical winter storm of this magnitude, a rancher would have consumed nearly a quarter of a cord of wood in a single night, frantically stoking the fire to combat the heat stripping. Elias looked at the wood box next to the cast iron stove. It was still 3/4 full. They had burned perhaps 4 logs since sunset. Sarah rose as the light shifted, moving to the stove not to warm her hands, but to boil water for coffee. The routine was shockingly normal. She touched the interior wall of the cabin. It was warm to the touch. "The floor isn't cold," she observed, looking down at her stockinged feet. In the architecture of the time, cold floors were an accepted reality, a consequence of raised foundations and poor skirting. But here, the Quonset shell extended all the way to the ground, buried in the earth and now sealed further by the drifting snow. The snow itself was acting as a secondary insulator, piling up against the curved steel ribs and adding another layer of thermal resistance to the buffer zone. The entire structure had become a composite organism, steel, snow, air, and wood working in concert. Elias poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Sarah. They stood together in the center of the room, listening to the muffled roar of the wind. It sounded distant, like a train passing miles away, rather than a force attempting to kill them. "Miller will be out of coal if this keeps up," Elias murmured, his mind turning to the mathematics of his neighbor's plight. He wasn't gloating, he was calculating. Miller's house, a single-layer timber frame, offered no resistance to the convective cooling. Every calorie of heat Miller generated was being stolen instantly by the wind. Here, the heat was hoarded. The efficiency wasn't just about comfort, it was about the preservation of resources. They could survive in this shell for weeks with the fuel they had on hand, while their neighbors would be burning their furniture within days. The storm broke 48 hours after it began, the wind dying down as abruptly as a switched-off engine, leaving behind a silence that was absolute and crystalline. The sun emerged, blindingly bright against the white expanse of the plains. Elias prepared to breach the envelope. He dressed in his heavy exterior gear, wool trousers, canvas coat, felt-lined boots, not because it was cold inside, but because he knew the shock that awaited him. He opened the inner door to the buffer zone, then the heavy steel hatch of the Quonset shell. The snow had drifted halfway up the curve of the steel on the north side, but the south side was clear, the sun already heating the metal. He stepped out into the world. The air was sharp, biting the lungs with a temperature that hovered near zero, but the sky was a piercing blue. Looking back at his creation, it looked like a submerged submarine, a glinting arc of silver breaking the surface of a white ocean. The snow had not accumulated on the peak of the arch. The aerodynamics of the curve had accelerated the wind over the top, scouring it clean. This meant there was no heavy snow load threatening to collapse the roof, a common failure point for flat-roofed cabins in the region. He walked a perimeter check. The bolts held. The seams were tight. He placed his hand on the steel skin on the sunny side. It was already warm. The conductive nature of the metal, usually a liability, was now working in reverse, capturing the solar gain and transferring it into the buffer zone air. He went back inside, shedding the heavy layers. Sarah looked up from the table where she was repairing a hem on a shirt. "How is it?" she asked. "Perfect," Elias replied. "The sun is heating the shell. The buffer is up to 50 degrees already." It was a solar collector as much as a shelter. The house was waking up, feeding on the daylight. Later that morning, the sound of a struggling engine cut through the stillness. It was Tom Miller's truck, sliding and churning through the drifts, making the slow trek up the ridge. Elias watched from the window of the buffer zone. Miller didn't drive all the way to the house. The drifts were too deep. He parked at the gate and walked the final 100 yards, his posture hunched, buried deep inside a sheepskin coat that looked stiff with frost. When Miller reached the Quonset, Elias opened the outer hatch to let him in. Miller stumbled into the buffer zone, his eyebrows caked with ice, his breath pluming in the cool air. He looked around the cavernous space between the steel and the cabin, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Then Elias opened the inner door to the living quarters. The heat hit Miller like a physical wave. He staggered slightly, the fog on his glasses instantly blinding him. He stripped off his gloves, his hands red and shaking. "My pipes froze," Miller said, his voice raspy. "The stove turned red hot, and I still could see my breath in the kitchen. I burned the fence post last night." He looked at Elias, then at Sarah, who was sitting comfortably in a light sweater. The contrast was violent. Miller walked over to the thermometer Elias had mounted on the wall. It read 70 degrees. He looked back at the door he had just entered, then at the strange, curved ceiling of the outer shell visible through the window. "I thought you were dead," Miller admitted, sinking into a chair. "I thought this tin can would turn into a freezer." Elias poured him a mug of coffee, steaming and black. "We burned 5 logs in 2 days, Tom," Elias said quietly. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered data. "The differential is 55 degrees. It's 0 outside. It's 55 in the buffer. It's 70 in here." Miller stared at the coffee, the reality of the numbers sinking in. He had spent 48 hours fighting for his life against the cold. Elias and Sarah had simply waited it out. The validation of the Quonset cabin was not found in the architectural journals of the day, nor was it celebrated in the town paper, but it was cemented in the silence of that kitchen. Tom Miller sat there for an hour, absorbing the warmth, his skepticism dismantled, not by argument, but by the visceral experience of thermal comfort. The crazy idea had proven to be the most rational response to the environment. The structure worked because it acknowledged the reality of the climate, rather than fighting it with tradition. The curve shed the wind, the double skin trapped the heat. The solar gain on the steel replenished the energy. It was a machine for living. When Miller finally stood to leave, the aggression was gone from his demeanor. He looked at the steel ribs arching over the cabin one last time. "You have to order the steel from the coast?" he asked, the question serving as a total surrender of his previous position. "Surplus yard in Denver," Elias answered. "I've got the manifest if you need the part numbers." Sarah walked Miller to the door, her hand resting briefly on Elias's shoulder as she passed. A small, silent gesture of partnership. They watched Miller trudge back to his truck, the figure small against the vast, blinding snow. He was going back to a cold house to thaw pipes and rebuild his woodpile, but he was leaving with the knowledge that the struggle was optional. Elias closed the heavy insulated door, sealing them once again in their sanctuary. The wind was picking up slightly, a gentle rattle against the outer tin, but inside the air was still, the heat was constant, and the thermometer held its ground. They had not just survived the winter, they had solved it. The old rancher turned back to the room, the experiment concluded, the hypothesis proven, the truth standing at a comfortable 70 degrees.